everyone, welcome. I'm so glad you can join us for this month's Coffee Talk. We have an absolutely fantastic presentation for you today. Just a couple quick notes before we get to the main event here. For those of you who I have not met, I see a lot of familiar faces, but my name is Emma Marston, and I am the interpretive curator here at the Des Plaines History Center. So just a few notes about today's talk. We are very fortunate to be sponsored by Village Bank of Des Plaines. And Melba, our lovely representative, is hanging out right over there. Hi, Melba. They are generous enough to sponsor these programs, so please do, if you have a moment, stop by, say hi to Melba, and she can tell you all about the fantastic services that the bank offers. A couple things to keep an eye out. We have a few events coming up in May that you will not want to miss. We have another one of our history and wine events coming up on Sunday, May 1st at Uncork Unwind, just around the corner. There'll be a wine tasting, snacks, all sorts of other goodies starting at 1:30 p.m. If you'd like to come, and I highly recommend it, please let one of us know. There are reservations required, but we would love to see you for history and wine. And then just make a note in your calendar for our next coffee talk in May, which will be May 12th, with Catherine Lambrecht. She'll be talking about family heirloom recipes from the Illinois State Fair. So a great chance to talk about the Illinois State Fair, and I think talk about some very tasty dishes. And today's coffee talk, of course, is by our very own curator of collections, Siobhan Heraty, and she'll be discussing the new exhibit, Growing Up in Des Plaines. And please stick around afterwards. You can see the exhibit lining the walls here. So definitely when you have a chance after, take a look around and really enjoy it, because it is a fantastic representation of growing up in Des Plaines. So please welcome Siobhan.
So thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. And like Emma said, my name is Siobhan Heraty. I'm Curator of Collections here at the Des Plaines History Center, and I am going to be speaking with you guys today on what it was like to grow up in Des Plaines from around the time this area was first settled in the 1830s to the turn of the 21st century. And our exhibit, Growing Up in Des Plaines, it goes into a lot more detail than I'll be able to get into during this talk today. So before you head out, please do take a look around the exhibits and flip through some of our touchscreen monitors, which we'll have back on later after the talk. We do have quite a lot of great photos from our archives of kids throughout our history here in Des Plaines. And if you have any questions about anything today, I will try to answer those as best I can at the end. But our exploration of childhood in Des Plaines focuses on the three areas where kids really spend most of their time. That is at home, at play, and at school. And in the city's earliest years, most of the children that were growing up here, they grew up on the family farms that stood throughout Main Township. But as time went on and this area started to develop, the character of Des Plaines changed from a small farming community into the modern suburb that we know today, that's connected to Chicago, the nation, and even the rest of the world through the many transportation networks that surround Des Plaines and even travel through the city. And so what growing up in Des Plaines looked like in 1960, for example, definitely was very different than what growing up here in 1860 was like, just because the character of the area had changed so much in that century. But as we will see today, there are definitely aspects of the childhood experience that did remain constant across time, and that we can still recognize and relate to regardless of when it was that we were growing up. And one of those constants was that kids were expected to help out at home, and that is chores. And so in the early years of the city, in the 1830s, and really for much of the 19th century, home life for a lot of Des Plaines families revolved around the family farm. And settlers from New England arrived in Maine Township in the 1830s, and they soon developed the area here into a lot of little farm fields, family farms. And the family's survival really depended upon the success of the farm, and every member of the family, including the kids, were expected to contribute to the farm in some way. So the whole family would help out during spring planting and fall harvesting. And these two seasons were considered so important to the family's livelihood that kids, especially boys, would be pulled from school to help out on the farm during planting and harvesting. And so the kids that we have on the photo here on the screen are from one of the family farms that used to stand around displays, the Mahler family, and we do have quite a few of the kids from that family helping out with onion harvesting on their farm in 1931. And so in addition to helping out with tasks like these on the farm, some other common kids' chores on farms would include feeding and tending livestock, collecting eggs, pulling weeds, chasing birds and cattle away from the crops, and hauling water for the family and for the animals' use. So those were the farm chores, but there were also household chores that needed to be completed, like laundry. And so in the days before electric washers and dryers, laundry was a physical, day-long chore that occupied the women and children, especially the girls of a family. And younger children would help out with carrying the water that was used in the soaking, washing, and rinsing tubs. And kids would also crank the wringer, which is at the center of this photo here from Laundry Day on the Jefferson farm in the 1880s. And that wringer would squeeze out the excess water from rinsed and clean laundry. And while carrying water and turning that laundry wringer were chores that were done by both young boys and girls, it was really the older girls that would actually be helping their mothers with the process of actually washing the clothes. And after the clothes were dried on the wash line, the older girls would also then assist their mothers with ironing, which was another very time-consuming physical chore, since pre-electric irons had to be heated on the stove, and the irons themselves were pretty heavy. They weighed about as much as a newborn baby. So ironing back around this time was also kind of a workout as well. And so some of the household chores that younger children would assist with, in addition to helping out with cranking that laundry wringer and hauling in the water they needed for the laundry, would include some food preparation tasks, like churning butter. And so the woman that's in the pink dress at the center of this photo, she is operating a butter churn. And operating a butter churn was really a pretty simple task. It just involved moving the churn staff up and down so that the plunger that was at the bottom of the staff inside the crock would start thickening the cream in the crock into butter. And so it was an easy, repetitive task that could be completed by kids as young as 7 or 8 in a lot of families. And so while most chores did serve pretty practical purposes that contributed to running the farm, feeding the family, and keeping the household in good order, a lot of girls' chores also served the dual purpose of preparing a girl for life as a household manager when she grew up and had a home and family of her own. And skills like sewing were considered necessary life skills for girls in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And so most girls learned to sew at a very young age from their mothers, their older sisters, their grandmothers. And they might be given sewing cards just like these that we have here on the screen that had some fun patterns that it was hoped would keep a child's interest in the task while she was actually practically learning to sew through creating her little designs here of the animals. And so these sewing cards belong to a woman named Mabel Steele Warnke, and she made them when she was learning to sew when she was about 5 years old in 1909. And after they learned the basics through sewing cards like these, girls would learn more advanced sewing skills through making dresses for their dolls. And once they became proficient sewers, girls were then able to help their mothers with the household mending, and they'd also be able to make clothing for themselves and other family members and contribute to the household in that way as well. And so another constant of childhood in the past and present are childhood illnesses. And so while kids today can avoid getting a lot of the illnesses that used to be very common in childhood, like the mumps, the measles, and even the chicken pox, thanks to vaccines today, Desplaines kids of the past were not necessarily so lucky. Childhood illnesses were a serious concern for a lot of Desplaines families because they could become very serious, and unfortunately, in some instances, they could become deadly as well. And so around the turn of the 20th century, 1 in 6 children in the United States died before the age of 5. And the common causes of death for children at the time were gastrointestinal illnesses, respiratory illnesses, and infectious diseases like diphtheria, scarlet fever, and the measles. And so on the screen here, we have a photograph of Evangeline Thede when she was about 5 in 1915. And unfortunately, Evangeline died about 5 years after this picture was taken in 1920 when she was just 10 years old. And we are not sure what she died from, unfortunately, what illness it was that she had. But she was actually the second child that her parents lost. She had an older sister named Alpha, who also died in childhood. Alpha died when she was only 8 years old in 1899. And so unfortunately for the Thede family, they only had one child, their son Clarence, who lived to adulthood. And so this was a very tragic experience for this family, losing 2 of their 3 children in childhood. But unfortunately, that was all too common of an experience for families in the past, since, like I said, the childhood mortality rates in 1900, about 1 in 6 kids died before their 5th birthday. But as the 20th century progressed, childhood mortality took a sharp decline, fortunately, thanks to improvements in sanitation, improvements in food safety standards, and milk pasteurization, as well as the development of immunizations for a lot of illnesses that could unfortunately be very serious for children. And when kids did get sick, they were usually nursed through their illnesses at home, mostly by female family members, and the family doctor only made a house call to treat the very sick, the very ill. And one of the doctors that worked in Desplaines and treated generations of children here in town was Dr. Clarence Earl, who's in the photograph here on the left. And he had a very long practice in Desplaines that ran from his arrival in this area in 1887 all the way until just before his death in 1938. And over the course of this very long career, Dr. Earl developed a national reputation as an expert on childhood diseases. And he was actually an early advocate for the diphtheria vaccine. And providing quality care to families and children in Desplaines was very important to Dr. Earl, and he wanted to make sure kids received quality medical care regardless of their family's ability to pay his bills. And he was the longtime attending physician for Maryville, and later on in his career in the 1920s and 1930s, he performed free school physicals for kids in summer health clinics that were organized by District 62 school nurses and PTAs, so that all of the kids, regardless of their family's financial situation, could start the school year with a clean bill of health. And now, unfortunately, not all children growing up in Desplaines enjoyed a traditional home life. And so, as I mentioned a moment ago, Dr. Earl was the longtime physician for Maryville, which was one of 2 orphanages that operated in Desplaines. The other orphanage was the Croatian Children's Home. And both of these homes originally opened as orphanages, but only a small number of the children that they cared for were actually true orphans who'd lost both of their parents. Most of the kids who were at Maryville and the Croatian Children's Home still had one parent living. Some even had both of their parents still living, but these kids were placed in the orphanages because their families fell on hard times, most often due to the death of one parent or to a parent's loss of work. And both of these homes, Maryville and the Croatian Children's Home, reached their peak populations during the Great Depression, when just the increasing economic hardship of those years had a lot of families turning to orphanages to provide for their kids when they were unable to do so themselves. And from the research that we've conducted, adoptions were rare at both homes. And some of the kids only lived there temporarily, just for a few years until their family situations were improved and they were able to return to their parents. But some children did actually grow up in the orphanage and remained in these homes only when they aged out at 18. And Maryville was founded in 1883 as a result of a successful fundraising campaign organized by prominent Chicago Catholics. And the Croatian Children's Home opened in 1927 and was founded by the Croatian Fraternal Union of America as a place for their members, orphans, to receive care. And both of these homes had on-site elementary schools, as well as a farm and a garden that the kids would help care for. And Maryville also provided vocational training in an on-site bakery, print shop, shoemaker shop, and tailor shop. And one difference between these two homes is that for many years at Maryville, the children lived in boys and girls dormitories. But at the Croatian Children's Home, the kids lived in small cottages with just a few other children and a live-in house mother that was intended to recreate kind of a family-like atmosphere. But the 1960s were really the turning points for both of these organizations. In 1969, the Croatian Children's Home closed since the number of kids that they were caring for had dropped to just 12 children. And so that low number of kids combined with the high operating costs of running the home just made continuing an unfeasible option for them, unfortunately. But Maryville in the 60s, they started to transition away from serving as an orphanage and transitioned to caring for kids from the foster system, kids with problems at home, and troubled youth, with the ultimate goal of returning these children to either a foster home or to their own families. But home life was not all about chores or tending to the farm. Whether it was the Maryville farm or the family farm. Families in the past and today, they'll often gather together after dinner in the evening just to pass the time, pass the evening together. And families in the 19th and early 20th century, they might spend their evening with one member of the family reading aloud to everyone else from the Bible or a book, or have one member of the family play a musical instrument to entertain everyone else while they played games, wrote letters, sewed, engaged in whatever hobbies they had. And in the 1920s and 1950s, through the 1950s, families instead might pass the evening with some background noise entertainments of radio shows or broadcasts on the radio of live music from Chicago ballrooms. But it was really in the 1950s when family evenings at home started to resemble ours today, when television started entering American homes. And the family deciding on what to watch together in the 1950s was a little bit easier than today because there were only 5 channels that broadcast in Chicago at the time. So that really narrowed down the number of shows a family could argue over watching. But primetime television at the time in the 50s featured a lineup of comedies, westerns, variety shows that would appeal to the entire family. But there was some daytime programming of the day that really was dedicated just to kids. And so that included shows like the Mickey Mouse Club and shows that were made here in Chicago like Bozo's Circus and Garfield Goose. And today, though, there are a lot of channels dedicated strictly to kids' programmings and a lot of streaming services available to families. So a 21st century family deciding on what movie to watch to pass the evening together was a little bit different and a little bit longer of a discussion than a family in the 50s trying to decide on what to watch. So That is one way that our family evenings from the 50s, even though they involve TVs still, a little bit different. And so evening family time brings us to the next area of childhood, and that is kids at play. And when Desplaines was first settled in the 1830s, the prevailing parental view of play was that it was solely an educational activity. Carefree play was not seen as a valuable childhood pastime at the time in the 1830s, and parents really placed a premium on toys that would teach their kids the skills they'd need as an adult. But by the 1850s, these ideas started to shift, and parents began to view childhood as a time when carefree play should be encouraged and toys could just be fun to play with, rather than have any sort of strong educational purpose. So by the 1850s, playing a game of leapfrog with your friends in the neighborhood, or like the kids in the right-hand photograph, playing with their pet goat in the backyard, that kind of carefree play by the 1850s, just fine with most parents. And in the middle of the 19th century, around the 1850s, 1860s, it wasn't just ideas about play that were starting to shift. Where kids were getting their toys was also starting to change as well. Store-bought toys were very expensive before the Civil War, and were really only owned by kids who were in the upper classes. So during Desplaines' earliest years, a lot of kids who were growing up here in the 1830s through the 1860s probably were not playing with store-bought toys. They were using homemade toys instead. So dolls made from dried corn husks or fabric scraps, figurines that were carved from wood by their dad, or some jump rope made from just a spare length of rope that wasn't needed on the farm would be some of the homemade toys kids would be playing with here in those days. But around the time of the Civil War, technological advances made mass production of toys possible. And these factory-made toys were then able to be sold at affordable prices. So for the first time, store-bought toys became an attainable thing for most families in the second half of the 19th century. And so they became a lot more common in Desplaines homes as well, and more kids were playing with store-bought toys here in this area. And dolls are a good example of this shift from homemade toys to store-bought toys. And dolls are also a toy that bridges the gap between the early 19th century view of toys as educational and the later 19th century view of toys as vehicles for carefree play. So early in Desplaines history, on Desplaines farms, a lot of girls were probably playing with corn husk dolls or rag dolls, but by the latter half of the 19th century, they were playing with store-bought dolls. And store-bought dolls, they were affordable for the first time, really, but they were on the pricier side of affordable, so a lot of girls only ever had just one doll to play with. And these dolls were commonly made from porcelain and china, so they were fragile, and some care did have to be taken with them. And if a doll was damaged, for instance, if the doll fell out of her chair during a tea party and hit her head on the corner of a table and wound up with a big hole in her head, the china doll, she would not be replaced herself, the whole doll, because she was very expensive. Instead, she'd be fixed, and a replacement head would be ordered, since that was much cheaper. And replacement doll limbs and heads were a big enough part of the toy markets that catalogs like Sears, like here on the left-hand side of the screen, they would sell a selection of doll heads and doll arms alongside their brand new doll ads in their catalogs. So dolls, they are also another one of these toys that bridge the gap between toys as educational and life preparatory from the early 19th century to the later view of toys as just being fun things to play with. Dolls encouraged imaginative play. They were the stars of girls' make-believe games. But at the same time, 19th and early 20th century parents knew that toys like dolls would enable girls to gain and practice the nurturing skills they'd need later in life when they had families of their own. And they also knew that dolls gave girls a good practical way to practice their sewing, their knitting, their crocheting by making dresses and clothes for their dolls so they could learn the dressmaking and tailoring skills that they could use when they were a little bit older to make clothes for themselves and their own family members. So in the eyes of 19th and early 20th century parents, dolls did have a bit of a career life preparatory aspect for their daughters, since at that time girls were going to grow up to be wives and mothers and would need those skills. And so toy soldiers and construction toys like Lincoln Logs are another example of toys that bridge the gap between the earlier view of toys as educational, life preparatory, and the later view of toys as vehicles for carefree play. And so like girls' dolls, these toys encouraged imaginative play, as boys would create sets out of Lincoln Logs for their toy soldiers to play within and to play out make-believe scenarios. And toy soldiers could also encourage an interest in history. And some boys who played with sets of historic toy soldiers, like Civil War toy soldiers, might find as a result of that they had an academic interest in history and might pursue that in some of their studies later in life. And construction toys like Lincoln Logs, as well as Tinker Toys and Erector sets, which we have an ad for over on the right-hand side of the screen. These types of toys were originally developed to help boys gain the design and spatial skills that might serve them well if they chose a career as an architect or an engineer as an adult. And Lincoln Logs, in fact, were invented in 1920, the 1920s by John Lloyd Wright, who is the son of the architect Frank Lloyd Wright. And John Lloyd Wright was an architect himself, so that was what he had in mind when he developed Lincoln Logs, toys that might encourage those kinds of skills, the development of those skills that you might need in a design career like architecture. And so that's an example of the types of toys that Desplaines kids played with, but who was it that they were playing with? And so the answer to who kids played with changed as the character of Desplaines changed as well, and the city developed from a small farming community into a modern suburb. And kids growing up on farms probably did not have very many close neighbors, so their siblings or other close relatives like cousins would really be their playmates. So in the photo here on the left of the screen, the sisters Elvina and Lily Meyer, they probably would have served as each other's primary playmates while they were growing up on their family's farm down in the area where Lake Opeka is today. But as Desplaines' population grew and developed into more of a suburb, kids would more often find their playmates in their own neighborhood, in the kids who lived nearby that were their own age, or in their classmates from school who lived nearby as well. So that is where the kids in the right-hand photo, where they found their friends. It was just from the other kids who lived on their block near Alfini Drive in the 1940s. And so Desplaines kids, they would make their own fun, and they would ride bikes in their neighborhood. They'd swim at Rand Park Pool. They'd watch the trains on the many lines that passed through the city. They'd also go camping with the Scouts. But a childhood pastime that was a bit more unique to growing up in Desplaines was ice skating on the Desplaines River. And a favorite skating spot for kids who were growing up here in the 1940s to the 1960s was a stretch of the river that was behind Ken and Margaret Meyer's home on River Road near Walnuts. And the Meyers, they made the frozen river behind their house into a really nice little skating area that could be accessed by stairs from their backyard, which is where the kids in the left-hand photo are photographed. Are on those stairs that led down to the river. And the Meyers would also, they'd string up lights around the skating area so you could skate at nights. They played music from speakers that were on the riverbank. And some people have even reported remembering the Meyers serving hot chocolate and cookies to the ice skaters. But the funny thing about the music speakers is that the Meyers also hooked a microphone up to them, which meant they could make announcements over those speakers like, "Jimmy Smith, your mother just called us. She wants you to come home now." So the Meyers made it pretty easy for Des Plaines parents to keep tabs on their kids and make sure that they made it home in time for dinner. And trick-or-treating, that's another event that a lot of people probably have pretty good memories of from growing up in Des Plaines. But trick-or-treating as we know it is a practice that only started becoming common in America in the 1930s. And trick-or-treating grew out of an earlier tradition of Halloween as a mischief night of sorts for kids. And on Halloween, kids would play tricks on their neighbors with pranks like soaping a house's windows. But they could be bribed out of these tricks by being given a treat like candy. So that's the origin of the phrase trick-or-treats. And over time, kids eventually stopped doing the tricks and realized they could just get the treats. And so that's how we got trick-or-treating as we know it today. But one of my favorite stories of childhood in Des Plaines comes from a woman named Phyllis Opper Bentley, who was growing up here in the 1920s, so before trick-or-treating for candy became a common thing. And so one Halloween in the 1920s, Phyllis Bentley and her friends, the trick that they pulled on their neighbors was done by taking a bunch of loose bricks from a house in the neighborhood that was under construction and taking those bricks to build a brick wall right across the center of Prairie Avenue. And Phyllis Bentley said, "I do not suppose that it was actually as wide and strong as the Great Wall of China, considering the workforce which built it, a bunch of kids, but it was certainly capable of stopping any vehicle coming up to it in the dark." And unfortunately, in her memoir, Phyllis Opper Bentley did not record whether any cars actually ran into the Great Wall of Prairie Avenue that Halloween night, but I'm sure that the adults in that neighborhood were probably pretty glad when trick-or-treating, as we know it, for candy, became the common Halloween practice. So these kids, like Phyllis Opper Bentley and her friends, they hopefully got the mischief out of their system on Halloween and were not the troublemakers in their classes at school, which is the last area of childhood that we'll be exploring. And the history of schools in Des Plaines dates back almost right to the settlement of this area. Within a few years of Des Plaines' settlement in the mid-1830s, there were 2 informal schools for local children that began instruction. In 1838, Harriet Rand started a school and taught about 15 kids in the cheese room of her brother Socrates Rand's home near the area that is today's downtown Des Plaines. And at the same time, a little bit further south, near Oakton and River Road, Mary Jefferson taught school in an upstairs room of her father Joseph Jefferson's home. And Des Plaines' first official school, a one-room schoolhouse, that opened in 1840 at Perry Street and River Road. But by 1894, Des Plaines school enrollments had grown to the point that the town was now being served by an 8-room school that stood on River Road, roughly where Shop and Save is located today at Metropolitan Square. And that 8-room school is on the right-hand side of the screen here. It's the Old North School. And that building was used into the 1950s when a new, more modern school was built to replace it, and they moved to that school instead in the 50s. But here on the left-hand side of the screen, we have one of their early classes in the 1880s, the students with their principal, John Quincy Adams, and his wife, Mrs. Adams, who was the school's teacher. And so the next great period of growth in Des Plaines elementary schools came after World War II. And the area's school-age population just exploded in the 50s and 60s, thanks to both the baby boom and the post-war trend of young families leaving the city for the suburbs. So Des Plaines went from having just 4 public elementary schools in 1945 to having 9 by the end of the 1960s. So the school district, their elementary schools, more than doubled in number in less than 15 years. And Des Plaines' private schools also experienced a period of growth at this time as well, thanks to the baby boom. And St. Mary's School on the left here is one example of that. They outgrew by the 1950s their original 1924 building that's in this photograph. And so in 1959, they had to build an additional school building so that they had enough classrooms to accommodate their student body that had just really grown over the course of the 1950s. And Maple School, that's in the photographs on the right, that was one of the new schools built in the 50s to accommodate all of these baby boomers that were growing up here in Des Plaines. But all of this rapid expansion of the schools meant that by the time the youngest baby boomers started to age out of elementary school in the 1970s, the school district was then left with more classrooms than they now needed. That the baby boomers were gone. So to solve that problem of too many classrooms sitting empty, the district decided to close one elementary school, and Maple School was the school that they selected to close, and that closed at the end of the 1978 school year. And today, Maple School, the building though, is still standing, and it's still in use by the Des Plaines Park District as their administrative and leisure center. So whether Des Plaines students were attending a one-room school in the 1840s or a school with graded classrooms in the 20th century, there were some constants to their schoolwork. Spelling tests, readers with highlighted vocabulary words, recess games, even doodling inside one of your textbooks when you got bored in class, like Paul Stott did here on the left in his 1890s school textbook. Those are some things that are constants about the childhood experience over Des Plaines history. But reading from primers, doing penmanship and math exercises on slates instead of notebooks, that is a little bit different from the school experience and living memory. And some Des Plaines children, they even received a little bit of their education in German, like the kids at Emmanuel Lutheran School in the 1880s. And at the time, in the late 19th century, a lot of German immigrants made their homes in Des Plaines. And the school textbooks that were used at Emmanuel Lutheran School at the time included translations of vocabulary words into German, since that was a language that a lot of the school students probably spoke at home. And on the right here, we have a page from Emil Stott's reader from Emmanuel Lutheran School at that time. And at the bottom of the page, there are some penmanship exercises for completing on their slates. But above, at the top of that page, some of the words from that penmanship exercise are listed with their German translations, so that the kids could expand their vocabulary in both of these languages. And in the 1940s and 1950s, there was another group of students from immigrant families that received bilingual education when the local chapter of the American Association of University Women operated a summer school for the children of Spanish-speaking migrant farm workers that came to Des Plaines from Texas to work on farms in the area here every summer. The summer school, it started in 1948, and it ran through 1957. And for the first few years, the school met in area churches with classroom instruction provided by volunteer teachers. There were also 2 Spanish-speaking social workers that worked with the AUW to make contact with the migrant farm families in the area, enroll their kids in this school, and answer the parents' questions. And these social workers, they also served as mentors for the kids as well during the summers. And by 1953, the summer school began meeting in classroom space at Central School. And by that time, the AAUW was able to raise enough money that they were able to hire professional teachers for the summer school, as well as have their curriculum planned by a curriculum coordinator that they were able to hire for the summer as well. And local pediatricians and dentists, they'd also volunteer their time during these summer school sessions to provide health and dental checkups for the kids who were attending the school. But by the late 1950s, farmland in Des Plaines was starting to disappear thanks to the construction of expressways and residential subdivisions in this area. And so as a result, there was less and less farm work for these migrant farm families in Des Plaines with each summer that was passing by the mid-1950s. And summer school enrollment, as a result of that, started to decline every year. And after the summer school session of 1957, it was decided that that would be the final session because the enrollment was going down, and they determined that in 1958, they estimated less than 50% of the kids would be back in the area that next year, so they chose to discontinue the program. And music and art classes, those are things that are commonly included in school curriculums today, but that wasn't always the case. When South School opened in 1906, and South School was later on renamed Central School in the 1920s, so it's not the same South School that's around today. In 1906, their fourth grade teacher, Miss Cooney, she felt that music education was something that her students should learn, even though there was no formal school music classes at South School. So she decided to teach her students about music herself. She had all of her kids make their own conductor's batons from the handles of old mops and brooms. They'd wrap these handles in crepe paper. They'd have some crepe paper streamers attached to the ends. And Miss Cooney, she made her own conductor's baton as well. And she would lead her class in song, waving that baton around, and her kids would follow her with their own conductor's batons. And so in that way, she was able to teach her kids how to find a beat and how to keep time with music. And just a few years after that, in 1910, South School hired their first music teacher to conduct formal music classes for all grades, which made school music part of the official curriculum and something that generations of students in Des Plaines experienced in their elementary schools, including these Riverview school students that we have here on the screen with their music teacher in the 1940s. So a lot of people might remember tornado drills and fire drills when they were growing up as a nice break in the school day, a chance to get out of the classroom for about 15 minutes. And the implication of possible disaster and danger were definitely not things that most kids were thinking of on fire drill day or tornado drill day. And these kids in this photo at left from a fire drill at a Des Plaines school in 1954, they definitely were not thinking about the serious nature of their fire drill. A few of these kids look like they are pretty happy to be getting out of the classroom for a bit, like the girl on the right who's just prancing down the stairs, or the kid in the center who's making faces at the camera. So they were having a good time with their fire drill. But emergency preparedness drills, like fire drills and tornado drills, those are definitely important things. And the students and staff of Emmanuel Lutheran School in 1918 could definitely attest to that, because their regular fire drills saved their lives. On the morning of February 4th, 1918, a fire broke out at Emmanuel Lutheran School, and there's a photograph on the right of the school building on fire that day. And the fire was caused either by a faulty flue in the school's attic or an issue with the boiler. Contemporary sources are conflicting as to what the cause actually was. But the school was evacuated quickly and safely, and all of the students and staff were unharmed, and that was because the school did hold regular fire drills, so they all knew exactly what to do in this situation. The building, though, which we can see on fire there at the right, was a total loss and did have to be rebuilt after that fire. And during the early Cold War years, emergency preparedness drills also included what to do in the events of a Soviet nuclear attack. And here on the left, Desplaines family, among some of their papers, we found this guide on what to do should an A-bomb fall that was published by the Chicago Civil Defense Corps in conjunction with the Chicago Public Schools in the 1950s. So the duck and cover drills would be to hide under your desk and cover your head with your hands just like you would in a tornado drill. But the Cold War didn't just impact emergency planning in schools. It also impacted what was taught in the schools. And so after the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik satellite in 1957, a lot of American schools placed an increased emphasis on math and science curriculums so that America could compete more effectively with the Soviet Union during the space race. And the legacy of this emphasis on math and science is that STEM education, which stands for science, technology, engineering, and math, those are still subjects that are still considered pretty important in a lot of American school curriculums today, just like during the Cold War. So that is one constant that's remained the same for a little while now. But that is a taste of what it was like to grow up in Desplaines. And if you're interested in more details and more stories of what it was like to grow up here over the years, then please do take a look at our exhibits that we have before you head home today. And the exhibit will be on display through the end of this year, through the end of 2022, so there's still plenty of time to check it out if you're not able to do so this afternoon. But that is all I have for you guys today on our presentation about the exhibit topic, Growing Up in Desplaines. All right, well, thank you guys for coming out today. Appreciate that. Thank you.